Okay, we're going to go ahead and continue now because we have quite a bit of material to cover in the second session. So the reason we're here is to talk about homosexuality. So the first thing we're going to need to do is to think about morality, because ultimately the issue of homosexuality is going to center around the idea of what is moral. One thing we need to remember is that morality changes as time goes by. And this is one of the problems with the issue of homosexuality. If you think about it, things that are happening today that are very common in society that people do in public, if you go back to the time when your grandmother was a young girl, these things would never be done. They would be considered very, very bad behavior. And yet people today do them all the time and nobody seems to care. Nobody seems to think anything about it. How does this happen? Well, it has to do with the idea of morality. The reason why morality changes from time to time is because morality basically is defined by society. Whatever society decides is moral behavior, that's what moral behavior is. Now, when we look at the time when your grandmother was a little girl, assuming that she was a little girl back in the 1940s, 1930s, 1920s, things were much different. The world was a different place. Because something happened in the 1960s that changed everything with regards to what we consider morality. And that was what people call the sexual revolution. It started in America, but it quickly spread all over the globe. And what happened was it was a time when everybody decided that everything having to do with sex was a natural thing. Sex is a beautiful thing. Kono, that's what they said. And so everything that used to be in behind closed doors suddenly was free to be done out in the public. And that's what kind of got everything started. In fact, homosexuality was a big beneficiary of this. Now, one thing you need to understand, and that is, when you go back to as early as 1960, or as late as 1960, homosexuality was legal only in about 30% of the nations worldwide. Now remember, there's about 240, 250 nations in the world. 30% of that is going to be about 60 nations. 60 out of 200 plus. That's all there was in 1960 that homosexuality was legal. Now, today, homosexuality is illegal in only about 60 nations. Only about 60 nations, and most of them are Muslim nations, because the Muslim law is very, very strict about it, and Muslim countries use their religious law as their public law, and that's something very important to consider. Now, what that basically tells us is that since 1960, homosexuality has become accepted worldwide and is now officially legal in almost all Western countries, all democratic society countries, and that includes all Christian nations as well. So how could homosexuality go from being completely outlawed in 1960, basically, to being completely legal, what would that be, 53 years later? That's worth investigating, and that's one of the things we're going to try to do. So one of the things that we want to point out is that it's not only homosexuality that has increased. All aspects of morality and immorality and anything having to do with sex has changed since the time of your grandmother. Because you can see other things that are happening on a regular basis that weren't happening so regular during the time of your grandmother, such as young people having sexual relations before they get married. That was not so common during the time of your grandmother. We have situations where young ladies become single mothers. They get pregnant and they have children and they raise them without a husband. And we have guys who get several women pregnant and have children by several women and they never marry any one of them. And also, it's much more common today to see men who are married to women who have families go out and get another wife with another family. Not legally, but a mistress. I mean, it's in almost every Tagalog movie nowadays. And we hear politicians, every time there's an election, it always comes out as some guy who's a politician has a wife over here with another family. I still remember in one of the previous elections that one of the main candidates who eventually won, his wife was interviewed one time on television because it had become public that her husband had affairs with other women. And she tried to put on a very brave face, and her comment was something to the effect that, well, if he didn't have these affairs, then I wouldn't know that he's a man. And I just had to shake my head and say, you know, that's just so sad that we live in a world that looks at things like that. Well, how did all this happen? Well, the sexual revolution in the 1960s had a lot to do with these changes. So it's not just homosexuality that we're talking about here. And eventually, when we end this, you'll see what I mean. So the problem, though, is that sometimes people, they focus on homosexuality because it's, in the minds of people, it was always such a bad thing. And so it's easy for people to talk about it in a bad way and to be prejudiced against it. But that's unfair. That's unfair from God's perspective, and it's unfair from a justice perspective as well. So keep that in mind as we go along. Now, if we go back to the idea of homosexuality, you know, the first big influence on homosexuality and explaining why homosexuality is what it is today, as far as the public nature of it and the acceptance of it, was the sexual revolution. But in the 1980s, since the 1980s, there have been political groups, gay rights groups, that are active in almost every country that work very hard and have worked very hard to get the agenda or the platform of the gay community into the public's eye and to explain to them who gay people are. And so what you see then is that basically homosexuals are not trying to take over the world. Homosexuals just want fairness like everybody else. See, it's like this. If the law protects heterosexual people, now heterosexual people are the non-homosexual people. They have this heterosexual, homosexual. Those terms are explained inside the material. But basically, the term heterosexual refers to man-woman couples. Homosexual would be man-man couples, woman-woman couples. So if the laws in society, and society provides for the happiness of a man-woman couple who want to spend their life together, they're asking, well, in a democratic society where everyone is free, shouldn't homosexual people have the same rights and privileges? And when you think about it from that standpoint of a democratic society, they got a good point. Because democracy doesn't have anything to do with religion. It has to do with fairness for all people. And so if everyone has the right to pursue their freedoms, and if I'm going to pursue this in the privacy of my own home where you don't have any right to tell me what I can and can't do, then shouldn't I be able to do that? Why should it be illegal for me as a homosexual to have my male boyfriend in my house behind my doors and we do whatever we want to, when right next door in the house there's a man and a woman and they can go in their house and close the doors and do whatever they want to and nobody seems to care about it? This is all that the homosexual community is really asking for. And from a democratic perspective, can't find anything wrong with that. Now most people who are not homosexuals, they don't ever look at it that way. But that's really what it's all about. In the final analysis, all the gay rights people are asking for is justice, fair treatment. Whatever you're going to give for yourself, we want to have the same thing. We should have that right because we're people too. That's all they're saying. Now since the 1980s, there's been a major effort in a lot of countries, Europe, America, South America, Africa, to get the population of the world educated about what the gay rights movement is really all about. And the gay rights movement and this whole thing has given us the meaning of some words that we need to know about and everybody needs to know about. One is, of course, the word gay. The word gay simply is the word that is taken the place of homosexual. It's a lot easier. It has less of a stigma attached to it. When people use the word homosexual, it carries with it some kind of a bad connotation. But the gay community came up with the word gay. You know, the word gay, what did the word gay mean before it meant what it does today? Happy. You know, and they kind of chanced upon it because they're happy people and they want to be happy. And there's no agenda that they have. They're just people. That's what they wanted to get everybody to understand. So that word attached to it. Then there's another word that's very common now, and it's being used more and more because the gay rights movement is throwing this word out in an accusatory way. Anyone that stands against them, they will say, you are a homophobe. What is homophobia?
Fear of gays.
Fear of gays. What do you mean fear of gays? Are you going to tell me that me, 6 feet 3 inches tall, weigh 220 pounds, that I should be afraid of a gay? Now, this goes back to the ignorance on the part of the majority of the people that live on the earth as to what gay people are, what their agenda is, what they would like to achieve. Because of these misconceptions, there's a lot of people who are afraid of gay people. Oh, they're going to take over the world. Oh, they're going to multiply, and they're going to take over our community, and they'll bring disease and destruction and all these other things. Well, that's just not true. Gay people are people. They're human beings just like the rest of us. That's not the issue. So, you need to understand what homophobia is, because this is going to be a very important word before we get to the end of this. Now, much of the reaction that we see to homosexuality has happened because very few non-gay people ever take the time to understand what being gay really means. And I have to admit, I was guilty of this before I really started taking my work seriously. Because when you think about gay people wanting to study the Bible, the first thing that comes in most people who are Christians' mind is, oh man, there's just no way this is going to work. But if a man comes into my office and he is in an adulterous relationship, there's no difference between me trying to study with that man as me studying with a young man who's living with his girlfriend and they're having a sexual relationship on a regular basis, and a man who comes in and says he's gay and he has a boyfriend and they have sexual relations. There's no difference in that at all. I approach it from one standpoint for all three of them, and that is this. Well, what does God have to say about your lifestyle? Does God approve your lifestyle? And what I try to do is go into the Scriptures and me first look and see what it says, and then show the information to the student and let them make their own decision. Because in the final analysis, it doesn't matter what I think. The only thing that matters is what God says. And my responsibility as a Bible teacher is not to stand up here and tell you what you need to do. My responsibility as a Bible teacher is to help you to learn how to study and help you to learn how to find the information so you can figure it out yourself. Because you're going to stand and have to account for your lifestyle, not me. And that's what this is all about. See, so we all need to take more time to understand what being gay means. And that's one of the things we're going to try to do in this part of the seminar tonight. Now, of course, we could spend a whole week or 2 weeks on this subject, but we don't have time for that. So I've tried to put the material together that will give you a brief and yet adequate understanding of what being gay is all about. So what does it mean to be gay? Well, the thing you need to understand, and you probably knew this much, most everybody understands this part. Being gay is all about sexual orientation. It has to do with what kind of sexual preference you have. For example, people who are gay are basically sexually attracted to other people of the same gender. Now, what is gender? Gender is male-female. So that means men are sexually attracted to other men, and women are sexually attracted to other women. But it's actually a little more complicated than that. Here's what I mean. Well, as I just said, a male who wants to have sexual relations with other men is said to be a gay man. And technically, people say, they use the term gay to refer to the men. There's a special word that they use for women. A female who wants to have sexual relations with other women is said to be a lesbian. Okay? But, as I said, it's kind of complicated because there are people who want to have sex with both men and women. These people are called bisexual people for obvious reasons. This is another classification. And there's a fourth classification that sometimes isn't covered, and that's what is called transgender. But a transgender person is not what you're thinking. You see, there are some people who are born into this world in one gender. Say, you're born as a man, you're born as a boy. But as you grow up, you inside feel like it was a mistake. Because it's not who you are. As you look deep into your heart and you think about who you are, you think, I'm not a man. I'm supposed to be a woman. And so the desire that you have in your heart is to change your gender. That's what a transgender person is. Okay? So a transgender person is someone who is born of one sex, but wants to be the other. Now if you go and do research, I provide on the very last page, or in the back, in the appendix, I give a list of several links on the internet. Most of them are Wikipedia that will help you to get information on more details about these things. But these are not bad words. These are simply terms that are used by the gay community and accepted by the gay community to describe these different classifications. But basically, being gay is about sexual orientation. So that brings up the question, why are there gay people? Why would anybody who's born as a man want to have sexual relations with another man? Or why would a woman want to have sexual relations with another woman? And why would anybody want to change their gender? Why? That's the big question. Now this is the one that would take us weeks and weeks. Well, basically, what we need to do is do a little history. I'm not going to be able to answer all the questions, but let's look at history and we'll be able to understand why gayness is what it is today. If we go back and look at history, you'll find that if you go back 100 years ago up to about 1970, homosexuality was viewed as a mental illness. In fact, I give references in here. You can look at major psychology organizations, and information that they have will show that in the 1950s, say in the United States, homosexuality was officially considered a mental disorder, and it was actually put in the books, in the textbooks of mental disorders. It's not there anymore. It was taken out about 20 years later. But it used to be people's understanding that someone who was gay had some kind of a mental illness. So, when you have a mental illness, where do you go? You go to the hospital. What kind of doctor do you have? Pediatric? Psychiatrist? Okay, so this then created a very, very, very important opportunity for psychology. Because since it was considered a mental illness, the doctors who were tasked to treat all these people were people in the field of psychology. Psychologists, they study, try to understand. Psychiatrists try to treat and change and cure this mental illness. Well, after decades and decades of research and testing and diagnostic procedures, guess what? They found it's not a mental illness. There was no cause that could be related to malformations in the brain, to any kind of glandular whatever's deficiencies. And so they basically said, this is crazy. This is not a mental illness. And so psychology and the field of psychology is primarily the area of that is responsible for helping us to better understand the reality of what it means to be gay. And so most of the information that you'll find available that tries to explain why people are gay is going to come from the field of psychology, because that's the field that was tasked to solve the issue of the mental illness of homosexuality. So basically what they determined is homosexuality is not a mental illness. Homosexuality is a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle that people can choose if they want to. In fact, one of the things that's interesting is that today, now in order to be fair, sometimes we have to bring out the reality of things that are not necessarily fair. I have been involved in discussions with people who are homosexuals who have been trying to say that homosexuality is a natural thing, it's biological, your brain is made a certain way and you're born with it, and therefore you're homosexual because your brain is born a certain way. Well, if you look at the actual information that psychology tells us, there is no scientific evidence to prove that. They have been trying, there have been studies that have been done, but there's no conclusive evidence one way or the other. They will tell you that most people who are gay at some point in their late to mid childhood, early adult time period, will begin to struggle with this. And usually by the time young adulthood arrives, they're pretty much decided where their sexual orientation is going to be. And then depending on the environment that they live in, the kind of support that they get or don't get, the kind of obstructions that they find, they will either have a happy life or they will have difficulties and struggles, and eventually many of them get mental illness, but not because they're gay, but because of the way they're treated, because of the bad treatments that most people extend towards gay people. But in reality, homosexuality is a lifestyle. That's what you'll find if you go into all the psychology stuff. And the proof of that can be seen through the current materials. Current materials, and I give you a sample of this with an article that I found on the internet from the American Psychological Association, which is the largest organization of professional psychologists in the world, over 150,000 members. Their organization goes back to the 1800s, and they have a very, very big archives of information and data about homosexuality, the history, the treatments, the whole thing. And this article that I gave to you, and it's given to you in the back, with my comments also in certain places, but you have the whole text of this. It will show you that psychology believes that homosexuality is a free will choice. It's a free will choice, and every psychologist should defend the right of the clients to make their free will choice. And that fits, because heterosexual or homosexual, everybody has a free will choice to decide who or what they're going to be. And so that fits right in. So homosexuality is not a mental illness. It's a lifestyle that you choose, just like any other lifestyle that anybody else can choose to do. Very, very important. Now, if we look at the current trends, basically homosexuality is no longer considered immoral. Now that's a big step forward. Saying homosexuality is a lifestyle that you have a choice of is one thing, but saying it's not immoral anymore, that's a big step, and that's a big change. Now how did that happen? Well, we're going to get into that. If you look at the current information about homosexuality, you'll see that it is the viewpoint of the field of psychology that homosexuality is a normal variation of human behavior. It is a normal form of human bonding. Now, how did the word normal come into this, considering that 100 years ago it was considered deviant behavior? It was considered mental illness. How did we get from mental illness to normal behavior? That's like black going to white. How did this happen? Very important. Now, what they will say then is this: so says mainstream medical and mental health organizations. Now remember what we talked about before. During the time when homosexuality was considered a mental illness, the doctors were the ones who were called upon to explain and solve this problem. They're the ones who've done most of the research. They're the ones that are making these determinations. They're the ones who are saying that this behavior is normal. Well, how do medical and mental practitioners decide whether something's normal or not? And besides that, here's a bigger question. If these guys, these doctors and these doctors and psychiatrists, if they say something's normal, should we believe them? Is there any reason why we should believe them? If they say something's moral, how would you know if they're telling what's right or wrong? Because saying that something's normal and saying it's moral are two different things. Aren't they? Interesting. So basically what we see, if we look at the current trends, the world says, when I say the world, I mean that big world out there, all has nothing to do with God, just the world. The basic collective opinion of mankind that is out here in this thing we call the world will say that homosexuality is normal behavior. And that's pretty much the reality. Now, let's go further. How do people become gay? Well, as I said earlier, some people say it's automatic. Some people say you're born with it. Psychology doesn't buy that. And here's the reason why they say it. Because if it's true, if I'm born with it, then I'm not accountable. How can I control something I'm born with? You know, that's like somebody saying, well, my father was a thief and murderer, my grandfather was a thief and murderer, I'm a thief and murderer, I must have inherited it. It must be genetic. Now, believe it or not, I know a very, very dear friend of mine here in this city whose marriage has completely been destroyed because of unfaithfulness. And when I went and talked to him about it, he actually believes that it was beyond his control because he said his father was unfaithful to his mother, and he believes that it's genetic and that he inherited that from his father. Now, we laugh and chuckle at this because we know it's not true, but that man believes it. And these people who say it, they believe it. But what it does is it frees them from accountability, because if it's like that, then how can you make me accountable? How can you make me accountable for something that I was born with? That's a very important issue, very important question. But the problem is there's no scientific evidence to support this. There's been no study. There have been studies done. Oh, believe me, there have been studies done, but no studies consistently report any relationship between what you're born with and whether or not you're going to be a homosexual or not. Homosexual people have self-determination. Now, this is one thing that psychology agrees with, because in the policies, like this organization, this is specifically referring to a statement in that handout that I give you in the back. When this organization gives its policies to its members, it enforces very, very, very strictly that all of their members need to preserve each client's right of self-determination. Well, that's very important, because if I have self-determination, then that means I can choose whatever I want. It means if I'm a homosexual because I choose to be. And if you really look at studies, even going back to the 1950s and 60s, there were some really, really big studies done on lesbianism in the U.S. And one of the big conclusions they made was that lesbians were lesbians because they chose to. There were a lot of factors involved, which I won't get into, but basically, they were lesbians because they chose to. Lesbians would never point to, in the 50s and 60s, would never point to and say, well, we were born this way, as to try to find some way to justify. They really chose to do it because of dissatisfactions with boyfriends or whatever. But it was a choice. But the psychological world will tell you that their clients, homosexual clients, do have self-determination. They are free to choose their sexual orientation. So that leaves one more question then for us to answer, or to think about tonight before we close, and that is this: the moral issue. Just because everybody says it's normal, and just because everybody says it's okay, does that mean it's morally right? Now here's where the difficulty comes in. Because when you talk about something being moral or not, it can't be answered by science. Science does not tell you whether something is right or wrong. Science tells you what something is, how it happens, and why it happens. And that's what medical science does and mental science does about homosexuality. They can tell you why people become homosexuals. They can tell you how people become homosexuals and what they do. But if you ask them, is it right or wrong to be a homosexual? They can't answer. Because science can't tell you if something's right or wrong. So, how do we determine? Well, again, as I said, medical science just seeks to understand what happens and why. It does not seek to decide if something is wrong or something is right. Medical science judges right and wrong from one perspective and one perspective only. And that's this. Is it legal? So it's like this. If homosexuality was illegal in this place, which it's not, it's legal. But if it wasn't legal, and I was a practicing psychologist, and you were my client, and you were a homosexual, you come to me and you say, Sir Barry, I'm a homosexual. Is this normal behavior? I would say, oh yes, it's normal. Then I would say, well, why can't I do it then in public? And I would say, because it's illegal. So should I be a homosexual? I would say, no, you shouldn't, unless you want to go to jail. So, determining right and wrong is outside of the field of medical science. So you can read all the things you want to from the area of psychology, and it will tell you that homosexuality is a normal part of human sexual behavior. But you shouldn't stop your reading and just say, well, okay, so that's the end of the story. Because the question of whether it's moral or not cannot be answered by medical science. So, one thing that you need to understand, if we look at the bigger picture of morality, is that morality is not a natural thing. Morality does not occur naturally in the world. Case in point, animals. Are animals moral? Do animals have a sense of morality? Does your dog know that when he pees on the tire of somebody else's car, that that's not a good thing and that it's immoral for him to do that? He should go in the bushes where nobody can see his private parts so that no one has to put up with looking at him while he goes to do his business? No, of course not. Animals have no sense of morality. Now, medical science has shown, not medical science, but science. Science has shown that we have observations that show that animals can show kindness to one another. Oh, I've seen all kinds of articles in my research for this seminar that document different animals. One was vampire bats. Vampire bats down in Mexico. The guys who study them have shown that certain vampire bats stay in the roost to guard and look after the babies and things like that. And the other vampire bats will go out and they will feast and get blood, and when they come back they will regurgitate the blood so that those who stay behind can have something to eat. Okay, does that prove that vampire bats are moral creatures? No. You don't have to be moral to help somebody out. Case in point. Somebody, some woman's driving her car and her car stops running, her battery's dead, she can't start it. So a bunch of guys are drinking over here on the side, they come out and they give her a push start. What do? They go up to her and say, Mom, what will you give us? Oh, wow. They're such moral guys. No, so there is no morality in the animal kingdom. Let's just go deep into it. Is there such thing as rape in the animal kingdom? You watch the Discovery Channel, you see rape you see things going on that we would call rape. If human beings treated each other this way, we would put them in jail and call them rapists and prosecute them to the full extent of the law. Do animals hold one another responsible for rape? Do they have a justice system? Crimes and punishments and all these other things? Not only for rape, but what about lying? What about stealing? Now, stealing is something that's been very much documented by the scientific world with regards to animal behavior. Murder! I remember watching a show on the Discovery Channel about lions. And here's the deal. A lion, pride of lions, is governed by a male. But if another male comes in and defeats that male lion, he will go and he will kill all the children from that lion. And he will make his own children in that lion pride. Now in our world, that would be what would you call it? Genocide. And yet, they don't think anything about it. The female lions don't protest. They just go on with their life. Why? Because morality is not natural. Morality is beyond the natural forces that are at work in the world. See, in the animal world, everything works by survival of the fittest. That was one thing that Mr. Darwin observed when he made his world travels. He went to all kinds of different places and observed. And he said, there's an observation that is very, very common in all species, in all places, all different variations of different situations of animals. And that is, those animals that are better suited and better prepared to live in their environment are the ones who are going to be the dominant animals. The strongest survives. See, that's why, going back to the lions, the strongest lion is going to survive, and because he is stronger, then the offspring that he will create will be stronger than the offspring of his predecessor that he defeated. So he kills all those young lions, and he makes a better gene pool for the next generation and subsequent generations to come. And it will continue to be that way until another lion comes and beats him. And that's how the situation progresses. That's what Mr. Darwin observed. Survival of the fittest. There's no morality in that. No morality whatsoever. But that's what makes us different. We're not animals. And so that's the reason why it's not enough for us to just look at homosexuality from a mere or a purely biological point of view. Because we can explain homosexuality from biology, but there's this thing called morality that we also have to look at homosexuality in, and that can't be answered or addressed with medical science. You see, because we humans, we set moral standards. Now that's important. When we say we set moral standards, what does that mean? That means we collectively decide what those standards are going to be. We collectively agree to submit to them, and we collectively enforce them and punish people within our collective who violate those things. And that's what basic morality is all about. But we do that. We will that to happen. It's not something natural. We're not born with a set of rules of what is moral and what is not. So this brings up a question. Who decides if something is moral? Who decides it? Who has the authority to decide whether homosexuality is moral or not? There's two answers, two possible big answers to this question. The first one we're going to cover now, and this will be the last of our material for tonight, and the second one we'll cover tomorrow night. The first answer to this question, who decides, basically can be found explained in sociology. If you look at sociology, which is the study of how people relate, how people in the world relate to one another, they have this explained very, very well. And the best explanation you can find is to go into sociology and look up deviant behavior. Deviant behavior is the place that has all the answers to the questions. Okay, what's deviant behavior? What's the word deviant mean? Well, if you go and you look, basically, sociology defines deviant behavior in this way. It is behavior that varies significantly from the social norm for that behavior. There's some terms we need to understand here. First of all, this one over here. Social norm. What do you think that is? If you mention something as being a social norm, what would you be talking about?
Accepted.
The accepted practice, the accepted way that people behave. Now, what's wrong with this? Who decides? Who decides what moral is based on this idea right here? You can already figure it out. Who decides when something is moral or immoral? Society does. That's the problem. And that already, you can see why homosexuality has become what it has become. The sexual revolution explains it all. Because when you look at what happened in the 1960s with the sexual revolution and look at what has happened since then, the sexual revolution has changed society's understanding of sex. Changing society's understanding of sex has changed their convictions about sex, what is permissible, what is not permissible. And those changes in the last 40 years, 50 years, have resulted in the basic idea of the collective understanding in society of what is right and what is wrong is not the same as it was back in 1960. That's why you can see the answer to the question, the first answer to the question of who decides if it's moral or not, by simply looking at society. Social norm. We determine what is right or wrong by the social norms of our time. And that's the way it is. That's the way it is in all countries. And the differences between one country's social norms and another country's social norms are what? What do we call that? It starts with a C. Very good, Bob. Culture. What is culture? Culture is the sum total of the collective social norms of now, plus even looking back to our predecessors as well. And it continues to evolve and change as time goes by. Why? Because people's understanding, people's convictions, people's education level, people's exposure to other cultures and other ways of doing things continues to change. so that social norms continually evolve as time goes by. That's why morals in a society continue to evolve as time goes by, because there is no standard. What is considered to be moral behavior today may be considered immoral in the future. It just depends on which direction the social norms of that society will go. On the other side, something that is considered immoral behavior today may one day be considered moral behavior. Again, it just depends on which direction the social norms of that society will go. Now, do you see a problem with this? Do you see any problems with this at all? Well, social norms are the determining factor in a society of what is right, what is wrong, what is moral. So behavior that is the social norm is considered legal and is considered moral, therefore. Because if something's legal, you can't say it's immoral. Not in a democratic society. Now remember, you've got to leave God out of this. This has nothing to do with God. This has to do with looking at things through the eyes of society. If something's legal, you can't say it's moral. So if homosexuality is legal in all the major countries of the world, you can't go into that country and tell a homosexual person, you're immoral, and be appealing to the democratic social principles of our society, because it just doesn't work. Because according to the democratic social principles of our society, if it's legal, it's moral. And what right do you have to tell me that I'm immoral? I'm not doing something illegal. That's what homosexuals would say, and from that perspective, they are absolutely correct. Because from a social democratic point of view, whatever the society wants, society gets. Wow, pretty interesting, huh? So, if a deviant behavior should become the social norm in the future, then it will no longer be considered deviant. And that's what happened with homosexuality. Homosexuality is a very good illustration of the point. I'm going to use the United States as a case in point. It was illegal to be a homosexual in all 50 states in the United States in 1970. At the beginning of 1970. On January the 10th, 1970, if you were a homosexual living in the United States, you were illegal. Under the laws of all 50 United States states. During those years, if you were a homosexual, you were considered a deviant. It was considered deviant behavior during those times. Now, you're doing the same things that people now in 2012 do. But in that time period, if you were in the United States, you were a deviant. Why? Why were you a deviant? Because it was practiced by such a small part of society openly, that people didn't know what homosexuality was. They were being guided by the taboos and the prejudices of religion and all these other factors. And that's what caused people to judge homosexuality the way it was in the United States. But the simple fact was, it was illegal. It was illegal, and therefore, because it was illegal, it was immoral and it was deviant. Because that was society's opinion of homosexuality during that time period. Okay? It was very, very far away from being a social norm. But again, the sexual revolution of the 60s changed. It changed America's way of thinking about sex. And even though you can't say that homosexuality became a social norm because of what happened in the 60s, it cannot be denied that what happened in the 60s in America didn't have a positive effect on advancing the cause of gay rights and homosexuality. Homosexuality benefited from it, and in 1970, the first state of the United States to declare homosexuality legal happened, and that was the state of Illinois. They were the first state. And what's interesting about that is if you look at the details of that, in 1970, there was one state that legalized homosexuality. And if you follow from 71 to 1980, there were like 10 or 12 other states. Then from 80 to 90, there were another like 20 states. It didn't all happen overnight, but after Illinois legalized homosexuality, then things began to change. Why was that? Well, because gay rights groups suddenly came out into the public and they said, well, people in Illinois don't have any problem with us. Why should you have a problem with us? And so the gay rights movement put a lot of energy into spreading getting rid of false understandings and miscommunications and bad information, and started going out in the communities and helping the rest of American society to understand what homosexuality was. And slowly, homosexuality came into the open. It slowly became accepted by the overall population, and then in 1993, the Supreme Court made a decision on a case from Texas that had to do with homosexuality. Very interesting case. Let me tell you a little bit about it. The case was Texas versus Lawrence. What happened was this is kind of ironic. In Houston, Texas, there was a call that was put to the police station that there was a man in an apartment complex crazy with a gun. And so the police went to the address, and when they went to the address, because it was a complaint about a crazy man with a gun, they broke the door down. And when they went inside, they discovered these two men having sexual relationship. Well, homosexual relationship was outlawed in the state of Texas at that time. They arrested the guys and charged them with sodomy, which is the way homosexual laws are usually worded, sodomy, the sodomy laws. And so they took these guys to jail, and when they were brought before the judge, they pleaded no contest. They paid a $125 fine and left. But they decided to make an appeal of their case to the higher court. So they did that because they didn't think it was right for the police to arrest them, because they were in their place engaging in private matters between two consenting adults and nobody else was being hurt. You wonder how the situation went from a crazy man with a gun, to finding two guys committing homosexual sex. Well, guess what? The guy who made the phone call was a former lover. The guy was a former lover of one of the guys, and he was jealous, so he made up this charge so that the police would go and break in and arrest his former lover. Now, what this shows us is that people who are homosexuals, they struggle with the same problems that people who are not homosexuals struggle with. And people can be just as devious and hurtful towards one another as anybody else can. But that's not the point. Well, so this case eventually went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in 1993 decided in favor of the guys. That yes, they did have the right to engage in this activity because they were in the privacy of their home. And that changed everything. Because in 1993, when the Supreme Court decided the case of Texas versus Lawrence, that automatically basically made homosexuality legal in all 50 states. And since that time in 1993, the situation now is completely different. No longer do homosexual people have to fight to determine whether their lifestyle is legal. They have the right to be homosexuals and walk free in American society. What they're looking for now is equality in their rights. And that's why you see so much about gay rights in the political arena now. And they have a lot of power because there are a lot of people who are of this lifestyle and they have the ability to vote. And so political candidates now can no longer just ignore this. They have to find some way to incorporate these people into their support group, or else they won't get elected for their offices. See, and so notice how homosexuality has evolved and changed in American society. It went from being completely illegal to being a main political force in American society. So, here's the point. Now that it's legal, it cannot be considered immoral in the States from the social democratic point of view. Because if you take a man who's a homosexual and you accuse him of being immoral, he says, on what basis do you make that claim? What I'm doing is perfectly legal. As long as people are doing what's legal, you can't say it's immoral. Not from a worldly point of view. So, bottom line in this, it took 23 years for homosexuality to go from being deviant behavior to acceptable behavior in all 50 of the United States. That's a very short period of time. That's half a generation. That shows how quickly morality can change in any given society. Now, how did it happen? Why did it happen this way? Well, basically, let's follow it. Once it became legal in one state, many homosexuals came out into the open. The general population came to see that homosexuals were ordinary, nice people and not people who were monsters to be hated and to be, oppressed. And the level of tolerance then rose to a point that homosexuality was no longer considered deviant behavior. Once it became a social norm, then the laws were changed. And now that the laws are changed, it's a whole different world. So in other words, the world simply changed its mind and decided that homosexuality was no longer a bad thing. It used to think it was a bad thing. Now it doesn't think it's a bad thing. Why? Because their understanding and therefore their convictions changed. And that's how homosexuality went from being what it was to what it is now. But this brings up some larger questions that we need to be thinking about. Just because society considers something to be moral, does that make it truly moral? See, we're back to the issue. Who decides? Well, if society decides, then there's no consistency. Because just because the United States has made these decisions about homosexuality, and they look at homosexuality in that way, does that mean that Saudi Arabia has to do it? Or Iran? Or the Philippines? Or China? No, because every nation is free to do whatever they want to about this issue. So, that doesn't solve our problem, because how do we determine if something is truly moral? Well, let's flip it on the other side. If something is truly moral, does the fact that the majority of people might vote to reclassify it as being moral, does that really make it moral? So let's say, for instance, murder. Let's say that a certain society, I use murder because murder is one of the almost universally condemned as immoral things that one person can do to another, right? And that's an extreme situation. But let's say that we had a society that suddenly decided, over a period of time, they changed their whole viewpoint of murder and decided that murder was a social norm. And as a result, the laws in that country were changed so that murder is no longer illegal. In that country, it would be moral to murder people. But are we really going to accept that it's really moral to murder people? Even though the majority of the people decide it's going to be okay? No. There's more to this than just what society wants. And that's a very good illustration. Is there such a thing as a moral standard that should never change, no matter what the majority of the people think? By definition, in social democratic circles, you'd have to say, no, there isn't. There isn't. We'll see more about this in the third night, in our final night. But it has to do with something called democracy. And when you understand what all that's about, you'll understand why the world is the way it is today. If so, then how can such a standard be protected in a world that is defined by social norms? That's the ultimate question. How can we protect murder from becoming socially acceptable if, in fact, we are declaring and proclaiming and defending every society's right to be self-determining? Because if we're going to say that we are a free society and we are free to determine our own course in the future, then we have to be willing to accept whatever the majority of people decide. Today it might be homosexuality, tomorrow it could be murder. Are we going to say that because we don't like the potential outcome, that therefore we won't allow murder to be even considered? No, because you're already violating the basic principles of free society. Free society, anything goes. Whatever the masses want, whatever the majority wants, the majority gets. Because it's all about the majority. So these are things we need to be thinking about. So let's summarize what we talked about tonight. The Bible message comes to us from God. It belongs to Him, and therefore it needs to be studied and followed exactly the way He intended it to in its original context. We only have the authority to teach what God says, not what we want it to say. Because it doesn't matter what I want it to say. The only thing that matters is what God says. The 38,000 religious groups that exist in the world today are violating these things in a very, very big way. Verses are always taken out of context, and people read a passage and they say exactly what they wanted to say, and people nod their heads because they trust their pastor, they trust their priest, and they accept what these religious leaders say, and never, ever, ever question these things for themselves. Now, we started our study on homosexuality. What we've seen is homosexuality has to do with a person's sexual orientation. Homosexual people are sexually attracted to people of their same gender. Homosexuality used to be considered a disease, but now it is believed to be a lifestyle that people choose to follow. The world now says that homosexuality is normal behavior. And that pretty much catches us up with tonight. So I hope that this has been interesting to you. Now tomorrow night, what's on tap is this. We go back to the question of who decides what is moral, because we said there are two possible answers to the question, who decides what is moral. The first answer was society, and we've examined what happens when society is allowed to decide what is moral. Next step is to look at the other side of the question. Whoops, sorry, wrong number. So the first answer was society. What is the second answer? And then, what does the Bible actually say about homosexuality? That will be what we discuss tomorrow. We're going to look at Old Testament, and we're going to look at New Testament. Then the third night, which will be Thursday night, the topic of the first session is the voice of the people really the voice of God? You ever heard that before? The first time I ever heard that was 1986, when the EDSA revolution was at its height. And one of the Catholic leaders was interviewed on the radio and asked, why is this happening? He said, well, the voice of the people is the voice of God, and God is intervening here, and He is making His will known. It is God's will that this regime be kicked out and a new regime take its place. So, is the voice of the people really the voice of God? By the way, that wasn't something that started with the EDSA revolution. A bunch of guys back in the 1500s came up with that idea. What role does democracy play in the changing standards of morality in our world today? We're going to look at democracy. And please understand, I am not a communist, I am not pro-communism, democracy, whatever. But many times we don't understand these terms and these things. But when you look at this and you see this, one of the questions, I'm going to leave you with a question at the end of this thing that is going to cause you, it's going to force you to think about some things you've never thought about before. It has nothing to do with communism. But it has to do with democracy, and it has to do with Christianity. And then we're going to look at the problem with the demos. Now, notice that this is the first part of this. This is this. And so if you know what this, who can tell me what this is right here?
Demos.
What is demos? Well, maybe you can do some research somewhere to see if you can figure it out between now and Thursday night. So if I ask a question, you can give an answer and impress me and everybody else that you're such a good student. But we're going to have some interesting discussions about these things. And of course, then we'll have your questions on Thursday night as well.